Okay, in this video we're going to go over the main features of dialog chains. We're just going to make a really simple little game that doesn't really have much of a point. We have our player here in the green. We have an old man and a baby and a snake, our NPCs, and a save point up here. We're just going to get a silver key from one of these NPCs and give it to another one, and then receive a reward from that NPC. So the first thing we have to do is give one of these NPCs a dialog chain. We'll give it to this old man here. So go to your chains and chain resources and right click, go to create dialog chain. Just name it whatever you want. We'll name this old man. On all dialog chains you have all these options up here. Most of them are just default options for your dialog and the user input nodes. The halt movement is whether or not you want the player to be able to move while the dialog chain is running. So we're going to check that so that once the player talks to this old man, they can't move until they're done. We have default show portraits and default show names. These are when you create a dialog box. This is whether or not there will be showing a portrait or showing a name when you first create them. So we'll leave those as true. Since we're talking to the old man, we'll set the default portrait to man. And we'll set the default speaker name to old man. The default container, we'll leave it as main. And the default text delay, we'll leave it at 0.02. And again, all of these defaults are not set in stone. It's just when you create a dialog node, it will have all of these values for its variables already. Halt movement is the only one that you're stuck with through the entire dialog chain. So when you have these set to how you like them, you click the Open Node Editor button here, and it'll open in another window. And I'll drag that to my other screen so we can maximize it. When we first open it, it's just a big gray box, and you want to right click and make your starting node. So this is where your dialog chain will start. And you can drag that around, and you can drag the screen around too, just by left clicking. So then after you create your start node, anytime you right click, you'll have all of your node options. So let's just have the first thing this old man says is a user input. That means that the player will have options to choose from. You can create that, right click on your start node, make connection, and left click on the node that you want to connect it to. So we'll start at this node and then we'll immediately go to this node here. And see, all of our defaults are there. Text delay is 0.02. The box container isn't main because since this is an input container, you can only choose from the input container types. We'll leave that at input. The speaker, again, is the default old man. You have a lot of other options. You can flip the image, which means that this image here will just flip horizontally when it appears on screen. That's mainly used because you can also switch the side of the screen that the image will appear on. So it's often used for if you're having a conversation with somebody, it's good to have one person on the left side and one person on the right side. So if I left it like this, he would be on the right side of the screen and his image would be flipped so he's facing to the left. We'll just leave him on the left and we'll leave him normally there. Use variable for images would be if you didn't have a specific sprite you wanted to use, but you had a variable that held an image that you wanted to use, you would check this, and then you would tell it what index from the list of images you want to use. And in dialog chains preferences, in another tutorial we talked about how you tell dialog chains where you're storing a list of variables, and that is the only time that comes into play, is when you have a list of variables that hold images and you want to tell dialog chains which index number from that list you want to use. But we'll not do that, and we'll just keep this old man. And he'll say something like, "Have you talked to that baby?" And you can say yes or you can say no. So we'll add two inputs. Yes. No. These here, you have no name. If you check that, then there won't be a box for the speaker name. So it'll say old man, but if you say no name, then you won't have a name for the speaker. If you say no image, then you won't have a portrait. So a lot of games don't use portraits. That's why we have in dialog chain preferences, you can just choose to always have your default set as no images, so you don't always have to click that button. But for now, we'll leave the portrait there. We have wait and we have fade. Wait is the number of seconds that the program will wait before displaying this dialog here. And fade is the number of seconds that the dialog will take to fade onto the screen. Most of the time you'll just leave it as 0 and 0, but every once in a while you'll want to fade the dialog, or you'll want to wait a few seconds before showing the dialog. So that's what those are for. So if you talk to that baby, you can say yes or you can say no. So if you say no, we'll add a dialog, and that dialog will say, maybe you should. And to connect user inputs to other nodes, you use this little plus icon here and drag it down. And if you want to delete it, you'd hit the minus icon and click on the one you want to delete it from. So we'll add it here, maybe you should. And now you can say yes. But the game needs to know if you've actually talked to the baby or not. So what we'll do is we'll add a check node. And the check will check to see if you've actually triggered talking to that baby. Since you don't have any triggers yet, you'll have to make one. So we're going to add a trigger, baby / talked to baby. Now, before I hit add new, I'll show you in your resources, in your triggers, you have nothing there. But when we click add new, you can see that it's added this folder called baby, and it's added this trigger called talk to baby. And if you click on that, you can see that the only data for all the triggers is whether or not it's triggered. It's just a bool. All of your triggers, they can be in different folders as long as they're in this triggers folder in chain resources. But even though they can be in different folders, they still need to have unique names, which is why I call this talk to baby and not just talked to. So over here we hit add new, and it immediately brought talk to baby into this trigger check. If you click here, you'll see all your triggers, and this is the only one we have is talk to baby. So this says if talk to baby, and we want it to be true. If it is true, if you say yes and talk to baby is true, then something will happen. But if it's not true, he'll say something else. So he'll say two different things depending on whether or not you've talked to that baby. And whenever you have two nodes connected to the same node, so you get something called rank. And the lower something's rank is, the earlier dialog chains will look at that node. Basically, since this is rank 1, it's going to look at this trigger here. It's going to look at this check node here, and it's going to see, is talk to baby true? And if it is, it will continue on. If it is not true, then it will go to the next rank. So in this example, this node is rank 2, so it'll check this first. If it's false, it'll go down to this one. So if you say you've talked to the baby, but the trigger check for talking to the baby is not true, he's going to call you a liar. But if it is true, he'll say, so you've heard about my key. So we'll call that good for the old man right now. We'll come back to him. So over here in chains, let's make another chain for the baby. We'll call it baby. We'll leave all of these defaults the same, but this time we're going to choose a different picture. We'll choose this here. And we'll call the default name baby man. We'll open that node editor. Again, we'll make a starting node. And the first thing that happens when you talk to this baby is you're going to set a trigger. And that trigger that you're going to set is talk to baby. And you're going to set it to true, which will trigger the extra dialogue when you're talking to the old man. We'll make a dialogue. That face. We'll connect it, and the baby will say, "Hey, that old man has a key. You should get it." And that's all he's going to say. If you don't want him to say the same thing, you can add another check note here. And again, when you create triggers, they always start as false. So you don't have to set talk to baby to false. It started as false, and then once you talk to him, we set it to true. So add another trigger check here, and we're gonna check to see if you've already talked to the baby. Then we'll go down this path. If it's not true, then you're gonna go down this path. You can see here that this is red, and this is red because we have this rank set to 1 and this rank set to 2. And any node that's not a check node is going to pass no matter what. And so this red line is telling us that we're never going to see this check node here because it's always going to go to this trigger set first, and that trigger set will always pass. So we're always going to go down this path, and this is unnecessary here. So we change that to 1 so it looks at this check node first and checks if it's true. So if we've talked to the baby, then we'll just make another dialogue, and he'll say, "Get that key." He's very excited about that key. Okay, that's it for him. Let's go back to this screen. Let's just see how that works so far. So let's go to our NPCs here. I have an NPC. I've made my own NPC prefab, and all it is a game object with a sprite, a circle collider that is set to trigger, and that circle collider is going to see if the player has entered the area that you want to be able to talk to the NPC, and a box collider that's not set to trigger so that you can't walk through the NPC. And then finally, we've added this start chain on interaction script, and this is where you put your chains. So I'm going to drag this old man chain into the start chain on interaction. So when I interact with this NPC by pushing the submit button, this chain right here will start. And the way it knows that you've entered this is that I set my player tag to player. And so this circle collider will wait to see if anything with a tag player has entered it. And once it has entered that, it's going to wait for me to push the submit button. And once I push that, it'll start this chain down here. A few things that also have to be set before we start is I have this game controller with my temp game controller script on it. And see, here is my halt movement variable, and this is my player, which I've already dragged the player onto it. There are other tutorials that go through the dialog chain preferences, and it's just telling dialog chains where your variables for all of these things are. So you're not going to have a temp game controller script. This is just the first script that comes with, so dialog chains has a reference for these variables. But if you watch the other tutorials about customizing dialog chains with your project, you'll already have this set up correctly. But for my project, I'm using temp game controller, so this is where dialog chains looks for the player variable. This is where it looks for the halt movement variable. And in temp game controller, we also have the inventory here. And I also have a chain audio controller, which will help the chain affect the audio, and an audio source. But I turn that off so we don't hear the music right away when we first start. Okay, so the old man has his old man dialog chain. The baby is also an NPC prefab, just like the old man, and we will give him the baby dialog chain. And we have our dialog controller all set up from the dialog controller tutorial. So we'll start our game. You can move your player around, you can approach the NPC, and you can start the dialog chain. It says, "Have you talked to that baby?" You can pick yes or no. His name is Chris, which it shouldn't be. Let me check what I did there. So I'll go to the old man, I'll open the node editor. And when I showed you that you can take away his name, when I brought it back, his name became player instead of old man. So we'll choose old man. And now we can go back and start the game. And we'll hit play. And now his name is old man. Have you talked to that baby? You can say no. He says maybe you should. You can start it again. Have you talked to that baby? You say yes. He calls you a liar because you haven't talked to the baby. Go talk to that baby. Oh, that face. Okay. The baby says, hey, that old man has a key. You should get it. That set the talk to baby trigger down here. You can see it's triggered now. You hit space. You talk to the baby again. He says, get that key. You go back to old man. Talk to him. If you talk to that baby, you can still say no. He says, maybe you should. Or you say yes. And he says, so you've heard about my key. And that's all we've done so far. So let's go see a few more nodes that you can put on your dialogue chains. Let's go back to the old man, open the node editor. So here, so you've heard about my key. There should be a question. Do you want it? Let's not make that a user input. Let's just make a dialogue so you can see that. We'll make this the player talking. And I have my player set up. If you look at my player here, I have a temp player info here, and that's where the name Chris came from, as the player's name is Chris. Apparently Chris is not male, and he has no experience. He has 0 melee stat, 0 range stat, and then here are his dialogue avatars. So let's give him or her one of the avatars. It'll be Hood, I think is the one that we picked. So again, this can be a whole list of different expressions, but for right now we'll just have one called Hood. And we go back over here, and we're going to use a variable from image, and that variable from image is talking about that list that I just showed you. And we'll set the index for image list to 0 because there's only one, so it has to be 0. We'll connect these, and Chris will say that would be great. And then we will give the player a key. So the next thing to do, let's bring this down. The next thing to do is go to your item experience node, and you can give an item or you can take an item. So we're going to give an item, and that item is going to be a silver key. I've already made this. It's just a blank item called silver key. So now silver key will be added to the inventory. And something games like to do is tell you that you've got a silver key. And so I'm going to pick dialogue. There's going to be no name and no image because it's a game telling you. And we're going to pick this game text container. It's going to say you received a silver key. We're going to connect that. But we don't want that to come up right away. We want it to wait about a second, and then we want it to take about a second to fade. And then we don't want the text to be written on the screen. We just want the text to immediately appear on the screen. So we're going to set the text delay to 0. And game text is already set to the very middle of the screen, so it doesn't matter if you switch this to the left or right side. Okay. The way we have it set right now is he'll give you an infinite number of silver keys as many times as you talk to him. So what we also need to do is set another trigger. You can either do this by setting a trigger if you only want him to ever give you one key, or we could do a check to see if you have an item silver key in your inventory. And that means that once you get rid of the silver key, he'll give you another silver key. And we would set that way at the beginning. You know, if you don't have a silver key, it would do something, and if you do, it would do something else. But let's not do it that way. Let's only have him ever give you one silver key. So we're going to make a new trigger. Let's put this in the old man folder, And even if you don't have a folder, you can type it in like this and it will create that folder, old man. Or if it already exists, you still would type it in, and that will put the trigger in the appropriate folder. And you can move the trigger around later if you mess that up or you want to reorganize. So we'll do this old man, and it'll be gave key. And we'll add it, and now this will set gave key to true. We'll go over here. Now we can go all the way back to the beginning. We can make another check node, the trigger check. Let's do an item check too. So we'll make a different check node called item check. So this trigger check will say if gave key is true, then we don't need to do all of this here because we've already gotten a key from him. So make that first. If trigger check is true, then we're going to check if inventory contains silver key. And the reason is this is yellow is because if ever you only have check nodes attached to an original node, it's going to be yellow, because if this is not true, if inventory does not contain silver key, then the chain will basically just stop here. So it's just kind of a warning color saying that you might be ending your chain before you really want to if this isn't true. So we'll have this check node. If you contain the silver key, then he's going to say, how do you like my key? And otherwise he's just going, if he already gave you the key here, but you don't contain the silver key, he'll say, I don't have any more keys. And we'll connect it down there. And I think that is good enough for the old man. The old man is done. Let's go back. We will look at now the snake. So let's create a dialog chain called snake. And we'll click on the snake and we'll drag snake dialog chain there. We'll go to the snake, we'll select his portrait called snake. Default speaker name is definitely Jason the Wonderful Snake. Default containers main, all this is the same. We'll open the container, make our start node, make our dialog node. Or how about a user input node? We'll say, wow, that's a nice key. Can I have it? I'll give you something in it. Exchange. And you can put as many inputs as you want. I've just been putting yes and no. And you can put, what will you give me? Anyway, we'll connect those. But you only want this to happen if you have the key. So we should delete this connection. We'll put a check node. Item check. If the inventory contains the silver key, this will happen. If it doesn't, but you have already been given the key, it's going to say, I don't need any more keys. And then finally, if you haven't been given a key and you don't have the key, then we'll have finally his default dialog will just, he'll look like a snake. So if you talk to him, it looks just like he's just a snake. Okay, so we'll go over here. Can I have it? If you say no, then he'll be disappointed. Oops, there's only one S. I'm disappointed. Connect that there. If you ask him what he'll give you, he'll say, I'll change the game's music and I'll raise your stats. If he says I'm disappointed, let's put an audio clip in there. We're just going to play a little sound effect. So for a sound effect, you don't want it to loop and you want it to be overlaid over the music that's currently playing. We'll leave the volume at 1, no fade for a sound effect. And we'll just put that smack sound in there. So he'll say I'm disappointed and he'll smack. And actually, we'll put that first. And then, if he says yes, what we're going to do is just like he said. He'll change the game's music and he'll raise your stats. So let's put another audio in. We're going to change the music, and which means we want it to loop and we don't want it to overlay. We're going to crossfade the old music with this music. The fade time, we'll just set it at half a second. Volume we'll keep at 1. And we'll put this way over here because after he tells you this, he's going to ask you again. So can I have it? I'm going to add 2. Sure. No way. We'll make this connection. And we should drag all of these out there. Because then this no way can hook to that smack, and this sure can hook up to this audio up here. So it looks a little messy, mainly because of the way I ordered the inputs. But you can drag things around and make it look a little bit nicer, like that. Alright, so if you say yes and you give him the key, it's going to change the music. He's going to take your silver key and this is also where you can add to your player's experience here, but we're not going to do that now. And is that what he said? Oh, and we're going to where did he say it? Raise your stats. So this is one of the more confusing nodes in dialogue chains, but I have this integer adjustment here, and I've attached these two integers, player melee and player range, to my integer adjustment. And I'll make another tutorial soon about exactly how you can customize this node to reflect your own game. You can look at the dialogue chain preferences, and there's some instructions in there on how to do that, or you can wait for the tutorial. But basically I have this integer set up to raise my stats whenever I want to. So you can tell it to raise 2 integers, or you can subtract 2 integers if you put it in negative. But we're going to raise player melee and we're going to raise player range. And let's raise it by 2 and by 2. There we go. So if you say yes, he'll change the music, he'll take your key, and he'll raise your stats by 2 each. And again, over here, if you don't have a silver key and you have already been given a key, so after you talk to him and give him the key, he's going to say, I don't need any more keys. And that is our snake dialogue chain. We'll turn this audio source on so you can hear this song I have playing in the beginning. The music starts, Snake just says hiss every time you talk to him. Talk to the baby. The old man has key, you should get it. Go to the key guy, go to the old man. And talk to that baby, yes. Already on key, do you want it? That would be great. And see, this is the image that we set to that variable. That would be great, she says. And here, you receive the silver key. Alright, that's the end of that. We'll go over this thing. Now that you have a key, he says, wow, that's a nice key, can I have it? You can say no, and you'll hear that smack. He's very disappointed. You talk music changes, we can look at the player stats. They were 0, they were raised by 2. We can go talk to the king. It says, I don't have any more keys because he already gave you the key. We can go over to the snake. It says, I don't need any more keys because you've already given him your key. Talk to the baby. He's still all about that key. Alright, and we can stop it. So there are 2 more nodes that we haven't gone over that we should go over. So let's go back to the baby. I'll open his node editor. And this is what his chain looks like right now. So if you remember that when you give the snake the key, he raises your melee and your ranged stats. So we want to add a check node. And in check nodes you can add as many of these checks as you want. Even though I've just been showing you one, but you can have a bunch of them in the same check node. So we'll make this check node. We'll have an integer check, we'll have 2 integer checks. Make sure that the player melee and the player ranged are both more than 1. You can have less than 1. We'll check to make sure it's more than 1 because the player starts with 0, he gives the key to the snake, and then it's more than 1. So we'll connect that, we'll set that to 1, it'll be the first thing we check for. And he'll be shocked that you're really strong. Okay? So the 2 nodes we haven't gone over are the pause and the sub dialogue nodes. So the pause dialogue is pretty self-explanatory. It just pauses the chain. So after he says you're really strong, let's say super strong. He's very, very impressed. So what this pause node does is after he says you're really strong, the dialogue chain will pause, which means that no more dialogue will come and your character will be given his control back, and you can run around to play the rest of the game, or you can come back and you can restart this chain. Now normally when you restart a chain after it's ended, it'll start back at the start node. But if a chain ends at a pause node, then when you restart the chain, it will continue from where it left off. Once you read super strong, then the dialogue chain officially ends, and the next time you start it, it'll go back to the start. And then the final thing is this subdialogue. Now, what subdialogue does is if you've already created a whole chain and it's very complex, but you realize you need to insert another whole complex chain inside of your original chain, rather than having to move everything all around, you can just make this subdialogue chain. And you can put another one of your chains inside of this variable and it will just start that chain. And when that chain ends, it will continue on with this chain. So let's just have the baby break the 4th wall and tell you that the subdialogue chain has ended. And now we have to tell him what your subdialogue chain is. So let's leave this. We'll make another chain called baby sub. We'll give him this stupid troll face. Call him baby man. Open the node editor. Now this is the sub node, so it still needs to start. His dialogue will say this is a sub dialogue node. And connect it. And this subchain can be as complex as you need it to be. We'll just leave it with this one thing right now. Back to the baby. Open the node editor. And now when we check for subdialogue chains, we have all of our chains here, and we'll just enter that baby sub. Careful you don't enter the chain that the subdialogue chain is in, because you'll create an infinite loop, and you don't want to do that. Alright, so we've added the baby sub. Now after we've given the snake the key, he's going to raise our stats, which means we're going to go down this path. Our melee and ranged will be over 1. He's going to be shocked that we're strong. He's going to pause the dialogue, say super strong. Our sub dialogue will start, and at the end, finally, the sub dialogue chain has ended. Let's go back to the game, and we'll play it. We need to talk to the baby to get the key. We received our silver key. Now remember, our player over here, his melee is still 0, so it won't trigger our new chain yet with the baby. So we go over here, we talk to the snake, we give him the key, starts the music, and now our stats are 2. We'll go talk to this baby. He's surprised that we're really strong. Look back at his chain here while you're really strong. Now we're going to pause it. So we continue the dialogue and it's paused. We can go over, we can do anything we want, we can talk to the snake. He doesn't need any more keys. Talk to this guy. Doesn't matter, you can play the rest of the game and never come back. But if you come back, you talk to the baby, and it continues on from that pause. So he says super strong. Look back at his chain, see we're here. He's going to start that sub-dialogue chain and then go right back into the end of this chain. Super strong. This is the sub-dialogue node, and then the sub-dialogue chain has ended. Great. And the last thing we need to do is work with this save point. So to create a save point, I created a game object with another circle collider that is set by a trigger. And I've given it the start chain on interaction. I've also made this save point script, which we'll get into in a second. But first let's make a chain. So we'll go down to chains, create a new one called save point. And we'll drag that into here. Save point is going to default no portraits, default no names. It will halt your movement. And let's leave the rest the same and open the node editor. So we'll make our starting node. We're going to make a user input. And it's just going to say save or load. We'll add 3. We'll have save, load, and cancel. If we save it, we'll set save trigger to true. So we have to create that trigger. Let's call it save. So if we choose save, we'll set save trigger to true. We'll have to add load trigger. Set that to true if we choose load, and if we choose cancel, just nothing will happen. So that is the whole save point chain. We'll close that. And now I'll show you the save point script. You can make your own save point script, but all mine does is checks while an object is staying in the trigger. It will check to see if the tag is player, and if it is, the entire time he's there, it'll check to see if either your save data trigger is true or your load data trigger is true. See, I have these chain triggers up here. So we'll either set this to true or set this to true. If save data trigger is true, then we're going to run save chain data.save and then set the trigger to false. If the loaded one is true, we'll run the load method and then set the trigger to false, so it doesn't keep saving or keep loading. We're going to pass to each of these methods save file path. This is probably not the way that you would want to do it, but just for this example, I'm keeping the string for the save file path in my temp game controller. I'm just calling it example game data1.dat. So it's going to call this save method, and it's going to pass to it that save file path. So back in your inspector, with the save point, we have to assign those triggers. So we just made them. We have load is our load data trigger, and we have save is our save data trigger. Okay, let's turn the music off so it's not so loud. And we'll hit play. We can go up here, and it asks us if we want to save or load or cancel. Let's just cancel for right now. Down here, it says that it's saved to, and it says temp chain data. Now what this is from our dialog controller here. We have the reset data after play mode checked. So all that this bool does is when it's checked, it tells the game to save the state when you immediately start play mode to this temp chain data file. And then when you leave play mode like so, it loads the state back, resetting any of the changes that you made during play mode. So we don't have to worry about those right now with our save point, But I will show you, we'll look at this talk to baby trigger. We play it. We talk to the baby and it gets triggered. We exit play mode and it gets reset back to normal. That's what the save and loaded function does from this bool here. But looking back, so it will start false. It's still false. We'll talk to the baby. Immediately set to true. We'll go back to the save point. We'll tell it to save. It'll say that it saved this data to our example game data1.dat file. Now, when we exit play mode, the trigger gets set back to false. We'll go to play mode again. Still, the trigger is still false. We'll tell it to load, and it loads that trigger data. And talk to baby, says get that key. He loves that key. Okay. So one thing to be said with this save point and the save chain data is if we look at that, you'll see that the only thing save chain data saves is the state of each of your triggers and whether or not you've reached a pause node in the chains. So if we just start the game, I'll run through really quick, get to the point that we need it to be. Now before we talk to the baby, see that our stats are at 2, right? Talk to that baby. It says, wow, you're really strong. And if you remember, after it says, wow, you're really strong, we get to the pause node. So it's paused. We go to the save data, and we're going to save it just like this. And we're going to leave the game. We'll come back. Talk to baby is not triggered. If you talk to him, he still says, hey. We'll go and we'll load the game. So we load it, and now talk to baby is triggered. And if we look back at his dialogue chain, we should still be at this pause. So the next thing he should say is super strong. But the thing to pay attention to is that the player stats are still 0. And that's because save chain data does not save your integer status, and it also doesn't save your inventory status. And I left it that way because every project is going to have their specific integers and their specific inventory, and they're going to save them in very different ways. And so I made sure that the chain triggers will keep their state and that the chains will keep their pause state, but the other data to save is really up to you and your project specifically. The game still thinks that we're on that pause node. So now I talk to that baby and he says super strong. And he goes on with the rest of the dialogue chain. But now, because my stats are 0, if I talk to him, he's still all about that key. So again, in your game, you'll have this save chain data. And what you'll need to do is just incorporate this save and this load method into your own save and load method with however you save and load your game. You can see that it's only saving trigger names, trigger states, whether or not the chain is paused. You'll have some sort of class for your game that holds the data that you want to save and load, and so you just want to add these variables to that class. And then add this whole section to your saving method, and this whole section to your loading method. And that's it. We went over pretty much all the features of dialogue chains. I'll still make a tutorial about customizing your integers with dialogue chains, how this has my melee and my range stats for my player. You're obviously going to have different stats and they're going to be in different locations. So I'll make a tutorial that will show you how to basically take any integer variable in your project and put it into dialogue chains so you can either add or subtract from it or use it in a check node as a requirement for the chain. You can still look at your dialogue chain preferences script. Inside, the code is all blocked off with comments telling you exactly how to do it. So you don't have to watch that tutorial if I haven't made it yet. You can just look through that script and do it yourself. So that is it. Seriously, everyone, thanks for watching. Anyone who's made it this far, I really appreciate it. I worked really hard on this product, and I hope you all like it. So thanks again.